Perhaps it is time for us South Africans to say sorry to Jacob Zuma. Because the news is out, South Africa is absolutely more corrupt than ever before. In fact, it is worse than under the so-called president of corruption, Jacob Zuma. Because according to the Corruption Perceptions Index of 2023, we are now number 41 out of 100. So 100 is not corrupt at all, and 0 is very corrupt, i.e. near the top of the most highly corrupt nations in the world. And we have never scored lower than 41, so this is actually an all-time low. And according to the report, South Africa is one of the few places in the world where corruption is not only just entrenched, but it has actually thrived. So now we achieve the same score as Burkina Faso, Vietnam, and below Hungary, China, and, ANC's greatest ally, Cuba. So what on earth does it all have to do with Jacob Zuma? Well, let's think about it this way. Jacob Zuma is the head of the MK party. The MK party is an ostensibly black first party. Look at all the rhetoric emanating from Jacob Zuma himself, and you can see a lot of anti-white rhetoric. Rhetoric that is not explicitly about white people, but he likes to talk about the population of white people in South Africa as the enemy of progressive forces in South Africa. And if we look back in time at how people treated Jacob Zuma when he became president, you can see why he is pissed off. Prior to becoming president, he was called a rapist, even though the court said he wasn't. But even when he did become president, all those white libs who are the corporate leaders of this country, they did not want to talk to him at all. I can't remember, in fact, when corporate South Africa actually did speak to Jacob Zuma in a way that was befitting of him being the president of South Africa. And because they didn't talk to him, he was left to the winds. And who was there in the wings to pick him up? Russia, China, and the Guptas. In fact, corporate South Africa and, the white middle class created all sorts of institutions against Jacob Zuma. They created Save SA, to save South Africa from Jacob Zuma and state capture. And even on that state capture, the ANC just sold out the foreign policy of this nation for a couple of $1 million to Iran, allegedly. But even way before then, Cyril Ramaphosa made billions of rands by selling out himself to white interests. But somehow, when Jacob Zuma does it, not for his own benefit by any means, but for the benefit of the Guptas or for someone else, that's called state capture. I think that is rightly unfair. And on top of all of that, Jacob Zuma was never radical as president. His caucus voted against expropriation without compensation. His caucus never actually wanted the NHI. His caucus of the ANC, as far as I'm aware, didn't have any radical policies whatsoever while he was president of this country. But when corporate SA's favorite guy comes into power, i.e. Cyril Ramaphosa, we have EWC, we have the NHI, we have all of these radical pieces of legislation that Jacob Zuma refused to touch. So you can imagine why Jacob Zuma feels rightly aggrieved at minorities in South Africa. We did not actually give him the time of day. And therefore I think it's only fair to apologize to Jacob Zuma, because seeing what we see now, based on who is in charge of the country right now, I think we can all agree that it was a much better time when Jacob Zuma was president. We had less load shedding. We had less violent crime. We actually had the World Cup. Not that that was his doing, but you know what I mean. And for God's sake, life in South Africa was hilarious. It was absolutely funny. Watching Parliament fight, having a change of ministries every 2 days, and Jacob Zuma just not giving a shit if the DA said Nkandla incorrectly. I really think South Africa was a better country under Jacob Zuma, because this was a sort of normal, non-racist, tribal Zulu nationalist. He didn't give a shit about minorities. He didn't want to denigrate anyone. He didn't demonize anyone either. He was just sort of straight down the line African president. And not only was he relatively harmless, but he also had some great ideas. He wanted nuclear energy for this country. He solved HIV through the ARV program. And believe it or not, we had far more economic growth under Jacob Zuma than we've had under Cyril Ramaphosa. And in light of this corruption report, we can tell that despite what Cyril says, Cyril is as bad, if not worse, than Jacob Zuma as president. I personally think Jacob Zuma was a much better president than Cyril Ramaphosa ever will be. And that's mostly because Jacob Zuma knew that he had power and he knew how to exercise it. Whereas Cyril just seems to be like a snake in the grass. Never wants to take any responsibility for anything, and he's quite happy to blame global forces or COVID or some other nonsense for his particular failures. And even then, he can't take responsibility of his own failures because he doesn't take responsibility for anything because the guy just doesn't make any decisions whatsoever. So here's the hope. Hopefully, MK absolutely fucks up the ANC in KZN and makes the ANC extremely nervous in the 2024 election. Jacob Zuma deserves some sort of reprieve. Hopefully he gets it at this election.